There is a particular kind of man that history finds difficult to forget, not because he built empires, not because he signed treaties or sat upon thrones, but because he refused, in every conceivable way at every conceivable moment, to be told what he could not do. Charles Vane was that kind of man. He prowled the Atlantic and Caribbean during one of the most extraordinary chapters in maritime history, the golden age of piracy, a brief and blazing era, roughly between 1690 and 730, when the ocean itself seemed to belong to no government, no king, and no law. And yet, even among the outlaws and sea rovers of that violent, glittering world, men whose names have since been carried into legend, Charles Vane stood apart. Not for his charm, not for his philosophy, as some of his contemporaries were remembered. He stood apart because of something simpler and far more dangerous. He simply would not bend. Where others negotiated, Vane attacked. Where others accepted pardons and quiet retirement, Vane spat at the offer and raised his black flag higher. Where others weighed risk with caution, he seemed to find caution itself offensive. He was, by virtually every account that survives him, a man of extraordinary ferocity, and that ferocity, directed outward at the merchant vessels, naval ships, and colonial ambitions that crowded his sea lanes, made him a figure that the British Crown desperately, urgently, and repeatedly needed to destroy. They nearly didn't manage it. Very little is known with certainty about the early life of Charles Vane. History has a habit of poorly documenting the origins of those who later become its most inconvenient figures, and Vane is no exception. What we believe is that he was born sometime around 1680, likely in England. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Though the exact location has never been established with confidence, he appears in the historical record already formed, already hardened, working as a privateer and sailor in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, during an age when the line between legitimate seafaring employment and outright piracy was often drawn not by the man himself, but by whoever happened to be signing his commission papers at any given moment. His early career placed him in the orbit of Henry Jennings, a privateer operating out of Jamaica, and it was likely during this period that Vane first developed the skills and the appetites that would define the rest of his life. He was present at the salvaging of a Spanish treasure fleet wrecked near Florida in 1715, a famous and chaotic episode that brought together dozens of fortune seekers along the colonial coast. It was the kind of moment that clarified things for men like Vane. There was wealth in these waters. Extraordinary, almost incomprehensible wealth. And the question was simply who was bold enough, or ruthless enough, to take it. Vane chose boldness. By 1706 and 1707, he was operating as a full pirate, based out of the lawless and semi-mythologized pirate haven of Nassau, in what is now the Bahamas. Nassau in those years was something between a town, a camp, and a carnival, a place where the dregs and the daring of the seafaring world had gathered under a loose and raucous kind of freedom. There was no real law there. There was rum. There were ships being careened and repaired on the beaches. There were flags of no nation flying from the ramparts of a crumbling fort, and there was the constant, low hum of men planning their next voyage into the open sea. It was, in many ways, the perfect environment for Charles Vane. He commanded several vessels during his years of piracy, most notably the Ranger, a swift and capable ship that served him well during the height of his power. Later, he would sail aboard other vessels, but the Ranger represented the peak of his operational reach. A vessel from which he conducted raids up and down the Atlantic seaboard and throughout the Caribbean, with a regularity and a violence that made colonial governors lose sleep. He flew the black flag without apology, and his flag, featuring, by some accounts, a skeleton-like figure, was not meant to inspire negotiation. It was meant to inspire terror. And it did. What made Vane particularly feared, and what has led history to remember him specifically as the most ruthless of his kind, was not simply the volume of his attacks. It was his conduct during them. Merchant captains who surrendered without resistance could sometimes expect a degree of rough mercy from other pirates of the period. Vane offered no such comfort. He was known for the brutal treatment of his captives, for torture, for cruelty that exceeded even the grim standards of his profession, and for a contempt toward his enemies that seemed to go beyond strategy into something more personal and elemental. He also demonstrated his ruthlessness toward those who would have called themselves his allies. When Woodes Rogers, the celebrated privateer turned colonial governor, arrived at Nassau in 1718 with a fleet of Royal Navy vessels and a royal proclamation offering pardons to any pirate willing to surrender, it was perhaps the single greatest test of character that the golden age of piracy ever produced. Men like Blackbeard accepted temporary pardons, calculated their odds, weighed their options. Others, exhausted and aged and tired of the sea, accepted gratefully and genuinely. Benjamin Hornigold, once a pirate king of Nassau himself, turned crown hunter. Charles Vane fired his cannons at the Royal Navy fleet and sailed away. He set a French prize vessel ablaze, used the resulting fireship as cover in the narrow harbour mouth, and escaped into the open ocean while Woodes Rogers watched from the deck of his flagship. It was an act of such brazen theatrical defiance that even Rogers, a hard man who had once circumnavigated the globe, must have felt a cold kind of respect for it. Vane was free, and he intended to stay that way. What follows, in the chapters ahead, is the full story of that freedom, what it cost, what it purchased, and how it finally, inevitably, came to an end. We will sail with Charles Vane through the height of his terror, through his meetings with Blackbeard and Calico, Jack Rackham and the strange, complicated Brotherhood of the Sea. We will watch the noose slowly tighten, and we will linger, as we must, on what his story tells us about power, about defiance, and about the very human desire to live entirely on one's own terms. Even when the whole of civilization is sailing in the opposite direction, the sea remembers men like Charles Vane, not fondly, but he remembers them. To understand Charles Vane, you must first understand the world that produced him, because men like Vane do not simply appear. They are not accidents of nature, random sparks of cruelty thrown off by an otherwise orderly civilization. They are, in a very real sense, products, shaped by economics, by war, by the particular broken promises that powerful institutions make to the men who do their most dangerous work, and then discard when the danger has passed. The golden age of piracy was not simply an era of adventure. It was an era of consequences, and the consequences belonged, almost entirely, to the men who had been used up and thrown aside by the empires they once served. To sail back to the beginning, we must go to Europe. The late 17th century was a continent in near constant conflict. England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands had spent generations fighting over territory, trade routes, and the almost incomprehensibly lucrative bounty flowing in from their colonies in the Americas and the Caribbean. The Spanish treasure fleets, heavy with silver from the mines of Peru and Mexico, were the arteries of an entire imperial economy. Whoever controlled those sea lanes, or could plunder them, held enormous power. And so, in addition to their official naval forces, the great European powers had long practiced the art of privateering, the legal commissioning of privately owned armed vessels to attack enemy shipping in times of war. It was, in plain language, licensed piracy. The Crown provided a piece of paper called a letter of marque. In return, the privateer attacked enemy vessels, kept a share of whatever he seized, and handed the rest to his patron. It was a mutually convenient arrangement, profitable for the privateer, militarily useful for the nation, and plausibly deniable in the drawing rooms of diplomatic negotiation. For much of the 17th century, this system had functioned as the empires needed it to. But then, in 1713, something happened that would change the shape of the Atlantic world entirely. The War of the Spanish Succession ended. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in April of that year, brought a general peace to Europe after more than a decade of grinding, exhausting warfare. It was, by most measures, a diplomatic triumph. But for the tens of thousands of sailors, privateers, and naval men who had built their livelihoods around the machinery of maritime war, it was a catastrophe. Almost overnight, the commissions dried up. The letters of marque became worthless. The men who had been encouraged, equipped, and celebrated for attacking enemy shipping were now told, politely but firmly, that the attacking must stop. They were discharged from service, often without pay, often without provisions, and cast upon an Atlantic world that had no obvious use for their particular and very finely honed skills. Many of them simply continued doing what they had always done, without the letter of marque, without the license, without any piece of paper at all, save perhaps the black flag they now ran up the mast in place of the ensign they had once flown with something like pride. The Caribbean absorbed them, the Bahamas absorbed them, and Nassau, a sun-bleached, half-ruined port town on the island of New Providence, became their unofficial capital, their gathering place, their harbor of last resort. By the middle of the second decade of the 18th century, Nassau had become something that colonial officials on both sides of the Atlantic regarded with mounting alarm: a functioning, self-governing pirate republic, home to perhaps 1,000 men, operating outside the reach and the authority of any crown on earth. This was the world Charles Vane stepped into, and he did not step carefully. The Nassau of those years was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary place. It was chaotic and violent and loud, reeking of tar and salt and unwashed men. But it was also, and this is worth pausing on, strangely democratic. The pirates who operated out of Nassau lived by their own codes, rough and imperfect as they were. Many pirate ships of the era operated under articles, written agreements signed by the crew before sailing, which spelled out the division of plunder, the compensation for injuries, the rules of conduct aboard ship, and the punishment for violations. Every man signed. Every man had a vote in the ship's major decisions. Captains could be, and were, deposed if the crew lost confidence in them. This was, in the context of early 18th century society, a remarkable and almost radical arrangement. In the world these men had come from, the Royal Navy, the merchant fleets, the plantation economies, a common sailor had approximately no say in anything. He was property of the ship, subject to flogging, starvation, and impressment. He could be worked to death at sea, and his wages legally withheld for any number of invented reasons. The life was brutal, hierarchical, and offered nothing resembling justice. On a pirate ship, at least in theory, things were different. Charles Vane understood this. He participated in it up to a point. He signed articles with his crews. He divided plunder according to agreed shares. He operated within the rough democratic framework of pirate governance when it suited him. But here, as in everything else about the man, there was a hard edge that set him apart from his contemporaries, where captains like Benjamin Hornigold, or, to some degree, Blackbeard himself, maintained a kind of rough paternalism toward their crews, a performance, at least, of mutual respect. Vane's relationship with the men who sailed under him was always more volatile, more combustible, and ultimately less stable. He expected obedience. He demanded courage, and when he felt he was not receiving either, his response was not the negotiated diplomacy of a careful leader. It was the cold fury of a man who had never quite accepted that anyone else's opinion mattered very much. This would cost him, in time, but that cost lay in the future. In the peak years of his power, roughly 1716 through 1708, the fury was an asset. It drove him, it drove his ships, and it drove the merchant captains who encountered him to the particular kind of helpless terror that his name, spoken in any colonial port from Virginia to Barbados, reliably produced. It is worth pausing, too, on the geography of the world he worked. The Caribbean of the early 18th century was not the tranquil turquoise vision of later imagination. It was a contested, violent, commercially vital zone, a place where the shipping lanes between Europe and the Americas converged, where Spanish galleons moved north from Cartagena and Havana loaded with silver and indigo and cocoa, where English merchant vessels carried sugar and rum, and enslaved human beings along routes that were by their very nature perilous. The waters between the Bahamas and the American colonies, the stretch known as the Windward Passage, the channels around Jamaica and Hispaniola and Cuba, were some of the most heavily trafficked and most dangerous waters on Earth. They were also, for a fast and well-armed ship with a crew willing to fight, extraordinarily fertile hunting grounds. Vane knew this better than almost anyone. He studied the rhythms of the trade routes the way a predator studies the movements of its prey. He knew when the Spanish plate fleets typically moved north. He knew which colonial ports were lightly defended. He knew how to use the shallow waters and hidden anchorages of the Bahamian Islands to careen his ships, resupply his crews, and vanish from pursuit as completely as if he had simply ceased to exist. The sea was not just his workplace, it was his landscape, his refuge, and in some deep sense his element, the one environment in which Charles Vane made perfect, terrible sense. And above it all, during those years, flew the black flag. There was nothing accidental or casual about the black flag. It was a deliberate, calculated act of communication, a signal sent across the water to every vessel that saw it. It said, "We're outside your law." It said, "We answer to nothing you recognize." And it said, most plainly of all, "You have a choice to make, and you should make it quickly." Most chose to surrender. Those who didn't, when Vane was the one who had raised that flag, generally came to regret it. The sea was wide and deep and, in those years, largely ungoverned, and Charles Vane intended to keep it that way for as long as he possibly could. There is a particular rhythm to a pirate raid that most people, raised on the dramatic shorthand of popular storytelling, have never quite imagined correctly. It did not begin with cannon fire. It did not begin with screaming men swinging across on ropes, cutlasses gleaming in a tropical sun. It began almost always with waiting, with patience, with a ship riding quietly at anchor in some sheltered cove, sails furled, men resting in the shade of the deck or swimming off the hull in the warm Caribbean water, while a lookout perched at the top of the mast scanned the horizon with a glass and waited for the silhouette that would change the day. When the silhouette appeared, a merchant vessel, heavy in the water, moving alone or in loose company along a predictable trade lane, the waiting ended. Quickly and quietly, the anchor came up, the sails dropped. The ship eased out of its hiding place and began to close the distance, running up a false flag, perhaps an English or Dutch ensign, to buy itself a little time and a little closer approach before the truth of the situation became undeniable. Then the false flag came down, the black flag went up, and a warning shot crossed the target's bow. At that point, the merchant captain had a choice, and it was not, in most cases, a difficult one. Charles Vane understood this calculus precisely, and he exploited it without sentiment. A merchant vessel in the early 18th century was not a warship. It was a commercial enterprise, crewed by men whose employers had weighed the cost of arming them adequately against the cost of simply losing the occasional cargo, and had concluded, often disastrously. That heavy armament was the more expensive option. The sailors aboard those vessels were not fighters. They were carpenters and riggers and cooks, men who had signed on to move goods from one port to another, not to die defending someone else's sugar consignment. Vane knew they would surrender. He planned on it. He counted on the flag, the shot across the bow, and the reputation that preceded him to do most of his work before a single man set foot on an enemy deck. But his reputation was not built on the easy surrenders. It was built on what happened next. The period from roughly 1707 through 1708 represents the fullest and most destructive flowering of Vane's career. Operating primarily out of Nassau and along the coast of the Carolinas, he conducted a campaign of raids that targeted vessels of every nation and description: Spanish merchantmen, English trading sloops, French ships, colonial supply vessels. His range was remarkable. He was reported off the coast of South Carolina, off the Florida Straits, in the waters around Hispaniola and Cuba, and threading through the channels of the Bahamas with a facility that suggested not just knowledge of those waters, but something close to ownership of them. The taking of prizes was, in the mechanics of piracy, a business. Plunder was divided: useful goods, food, water, rope, canvas, naval stores, were transferred to the pirate vessel or its prizes. Valuables were catalogued and distributed according to the articles. Ships that were useful were kept. Those that were not, or that were too large or too damaged to be worth managing, were burned or sunk or simply cast adrift with their surviving crew. Vane was efficient at all of this, but efficiency was not what distinguished him. What distinguished him was the violence that fell outside the transaction. Contemporary accounts, drawn from the testimonies of survivors, from colonial government records, from the later trial proceedings that followed the collapse of the pirate republic, described Vane as a captain who inflicted suffering on his captives that went well beyond any practical necessity. Prisoners were beaten, tortured for information about hidden valuables or the locations of other vessels, and subjected to cruelties that even experienced sailors, men who had seen the brutalities of the Royal Navy's discipline, found shocking enough to record and report. There are accounts of captives being hoisted by their thumbs, of floggings administered with a deliberation and duration that suggested enjoyment rather than expedience, of men being held overboard by their ankles while Vane interrogated them about cargo manifests. This was not universal pirate conduct. It bears saying clearly, because the golden age of piracy has been romanticized in ways that often blur this distinction. Many of Vane's contemporaries operated with a markedly different philosophy. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, the most prolific pirate of the entire era in terms of vessels taken, ran his ship with a strict moral code, prohibited gambling and alcohol during certain hours, and was known to treat prisoners with considerable civility when they cooperated. Even Blackbeard, whose carefully cultivated image of supernatural menace has made him the most famous pirate in history, was by most accounts more performer than sadist. The terror was, to a significant degree, theater. Vane's terror was not theater. It was operational. It was considered, and it served a purpose that he understood very clearly. A reputation for absolute ruthlessness meant that future targets surrendered faster, gave up their cargo more readily, and told him what he wanted to know without extended persuasion. Fear, systematically cultivated and reinforced, was an economic tool, and Vane wielded it with the same cold calculation that a merchant might apply to the pricing of his goods. In the summer of 1708, he conducted what became perhaps his most notorious series of raids along the coast of the Carolinas. The American colonial coast in those years was deeply vulnerable. Ports like Charleston and Bath and Beaufort sat at the edge of a vast and sparsely administered wilderness. Their connections to the Royal Navy, thin and unreliable, their local militias poorly equipped for naval engagements, colonial governors sent desperate letters to London describing the situation in terms that barely concealed their fear. Ships were being taken within sight of the shore. Trade was being choked off. Merchants were refusing to send vessels out of port at all, calculating that the risk outweighed any potential profit. Vane was not the only pirate responsible for this state of affairs. Blackbeard's blockade of Charleston Harbor earlier that same year had been the single most dramatic act of piracy along the American coast during the entire period. But Vane's sustained, grinding campaign contributed materially to the sense of crisis, and his name appeared in colonial dispatches with a frequency and an urgency that made clear he was regarded as a primary threat. He was also, during this period, making enemies within his own world. The pirate community of Nassau, for all its democratic pretensions, was not without its own politics and its own social pressures. There were disputes over prizes, disputes over leadership, disputes over who had the right to operate in which waters and under whose loose authority. Vane's volatile temper and his instinct for dominance made him a difficult man to cooperate with, and there are indications in the historical record that his relationships with other major pirate captains during this period were complicated by mutual suspicion and competition. He did, however, have his alliances, most notably with a young and charismatic captain who sailed under him for a time before striking out on his own. A man named John Rackham, known to history as Calico Jack, for the brightly colored calico clothing he favored. Rackham served as Vane's quartermaster, a position of considerable authority aboard a pirate vessel, responsible for managing the crew's discipline and the distribution of plunder. It was a partnership that functioned, for a time, reasonably well. The two men had complementary instincts, Vane for the hunt and the taking, Rackham for the management of what was taken and the maintenance of crew morale. But the partnership carried within it the seeds of a confrontation that would have significant consequences for Vane's career, because Calico Jack, for all his qualities, had a different philosophy about acceptable risk. And in the autumn of 1718, that difference would come to a head in a way that Vane did not see coming, and that, looking back, perhaps should have warned him that the ground beneath his feet was not as solid as it seemed. Before that rupture, though, there was one more episode that deserves its full telling, an episode that captures, more completely than any other single event, the particular quality of Charles Vane's courage, or perhaps his madness, the line between the two being, in his case, genuinely difficult to locate. In the late summer of 1718, Vane encountered a French naval warship in the waters near the Bahamas. A French man of war, a vessel of the line, armed with guns that vastly outweighed anything the Ranger could bring to bear, crewed by trained naval gunners, sailing under the flag of a nation that was emphatically not interested in being robbed. Most pirate captains faced with such an encounter would have done the same thing without a second thought, turned, run, and been grateful for the wind. The mathematics of such a meeting were not complicated. A pirate sloop against a naval warship was not a battle. It was an execution. Vane turned and ran. His crew, by multiple accounts, expected him to fight. They had sailed under a captain who seemed to regard danger as a personal affront, who had never shown the slightest inclination toward prudence when prudence conflicted with aggression. To see him order the retreat was not simply surprising. To some of them, it was damning. It was, they would later argue. At a crew vote that had consequences Vane could not have anticipated, an act of cowardice, whether it was cowardice or simply the one moment of genuine tactical wisdom in an otherwise reckless career, history does not resolve. What history records is the result. The crew voted. Vane lost, and the man who replaced him as captain of the Ranger was none other than Calico Jack Rackham, who set Vane adrift in a small sloop with the men who had remained loyal to him, and sailed away with the rest. It was, for a man of Vane's temperament, the most humiliating possible outcome. But Charles Vane was not finished, not even close. There is a temptation, when studying the pirates of the Golden Age, to view them as solitary figures. Lone wolves, men who operated in proud and absolute isolation from the world that had rejected them, answering to no one, connected to nothing, burning bright and alone against the dark water. The truth is considerably more interesting. The pirates of the early 18th century existed within a genuine community, fragile, fractious, and often violent, but a community nonetheless. They shared information about patrol routes and safe anchorages. They traded provisions and ammunition. They careened their ships on the same beaches, drank at the same rough taverns, and kept an informal but functioning network of intelligence about which waters were hot with naval activity and which were quiet enough to work. They knew each other. In many cases they had sailed together, had fought side by side under shared articles, had divided the same plunder and slept on the same rolling decks under the same Caribbean stars. Charles Vane was part of this world, fully, deeply, and on his own uncompromising terms. To understand that world, and Vane's place within it, we must spend some time in Nassau itself, not the Nassau of arrival and departure, of the frantic activity of preparing for sea, but the Nassau of the intervals, the Nassau that existed between voyages, when men came ashore with prizes to spend and months of tension to release, and the strange, suspended civilization of the pirate republic settled into something that almost resembled ordinary life. New Providence Island, where Nassau sat, is a flat and low-lying place, not dramatic by Caribbean standards, without the volcanic peaks of the Windward Islands or the lush interior mountains of Jamaica. What it had was a harbor, a deep, well-sheltered, easily defensible harbor, protected by a narrow entrance that large naval vessels found difficult to navigate, and flanked by a crumbling fort whose guns, when they were functional, commanded the approach with reasonable effectiveness. The pirates had not built Nassau. They had simply moved into it, filling the vacuum left by decades of colonial neglect and Spanish raids that had driven away most of the legitimate settlers. By 1716, the population of Nassau was perhaps 1,000 souls, of whom a substantial majority were pirates or those who depended on pirates for their livelihoods. Tavern keepers, prostitutes, carpenters, and blacksmiths who repaired ships and asked no questions. Merchants of a flexible moral disposition who would buy anything and sell anything and record nothing. It was, in its way, a functioning economy. A dark mirror of the colonial port towns it preyed upon, but an economy nonetheless. And into this world, Vane moved like a man who had finally found the place that suited him. He was not the most famous pirate in Nassau. That distinction belonged, unambiguously, to the man known as Blackbeard, Edward Teach, or Thatch, depending on which historical source you consult, whose very name had become a kind of shorthand for maritime terror across the Atlantic world. Blackbeard was extraordinary, and it is worth pausing on him here, not merely for his own sake, but for what the contrast between him and Vane reveals about the different ways a man could be dangerous at sea. Blackbeard was a performer. This is not a diminishment. It is, in fact, perhaps the highest compliment one can pay to a man whose greatest weapon was not his cannons, but his reputation. He cultivated his appearance with deliberate, theatrical precision, the enormous black beard that gave him his name, tied into braids with colored ribbons, the slow-burning cannon fuses tucked under his hat during battle so that his face wreathed in smoke and sulfur, giving him the appearance of a man stepping directly out of hell. He was large, physically imposing, and possessed of an intelligence that understood, perhaps better than any other pirate of his era, that the most efficient violence is the violence you never actually have to commit, provided you have convinced your enemy that you are fully, cheerfully prepared to do so. Vane and Blackbeard knew each other. They operated in overlapping waters, shared the harbor at Nassau during the same period, and appear to have maintained a relationship that was, if not precisely warm, at least one of professional acknowledgement between two men who recognized in each other a similar quality of resolve. There is no record of open conflict between them, which itself says something. Vane did not shy from conflict with anyone he felt was worth confronting, and the absence of friction between him and Blackbeard suggests a mutual, if unspoken, respect. There was also Benjamin Hornigold, who had been in some ways the founding father of the Nassau Pirate Republic, the captain who had first established the settlement as a serious base of operations, who had mentored a generation of pirates including Blackbeard himself, and who would, in the end, make the choice that Vane found most contemptible, acceptance of the royal pardon, followed by active service as a pirate hunter on behalf of the crown he had spent years defying. Hornigold's transformation is one of the more psychologically complex episodes of the entire era, and Vane's response to it, fury, contempt, and a deepened commitment to his own refusal, tells us a great deal about the values, such as they were, that Vane held most dear. Loyalty, or rather a particular pirate conception of loyalty, not to any nation or institution, but to the community, to the articles, to the black flag, and everything it represented. Hornigold's pardon was, in Vane's eyes, not a pragmatic choice, but a betrayal, a fundamental and unforgivable abandonment of the world they had built together. It is worth noting here that Vane himself had been offered the pardon. The Royal Proclamation of 1717, issued by King George I, extended a general amnesty to any pirate who surrendered to a British authority before September of that year. Many took it. Some genuinely meant to reform. Others took it as a temporary shelter, a chance to regroup and eventually return to sea under the flag they preferred. Vane did neither. He rejected the offer entirely, without apparent deliberation, with a kind of immediate and almost reflexive contempt that suggests it had never, even for a moment, presented itself to him as a genuine option. He was, by this point, constitutionally incapable of submission. It was not stubbornness in the ordinary sense, not the mulishness of a man who simply dislikes being told what to do. It was something more fundamental, something that had been baked into him by the life he had lived, by the experiences that had shaped him in those undocumented years before the historical record picks him up. He understood with perfect clarity what accepting that pardon would mean. It would mean returning to the world he had left, the world of hierarchy and deference, of captains who could flog you without cause, and merchants who could cheat you without consequence, of a social order that had decided, long before you arrived, exactly how much you were worth, and exactly how little that was. He would rather burn. And in the summer of 1718, in the days just before Woodes Rogers arrived with his fleet and his proclamation and his offer of amnesty backed by the implicit threat of the gallows, Nassau was alive with this question. Every man in the harbor was doing the same calculation, reaching different answers. The conversations happening in those taverns and on those careening beaches were not casual. They were existential. They were men deciding, in the most literal possible sense, what kind of lives they were prepared to live and what risks they were prepared to accept in pursuit of those lives. Vane had already decided. He had decided long before the question was formally posed. What he did in the days surrounding Rogers's arrival has already been touched upon in our opening. The fire ship, the blazing French prize vessel sent into the harbor mouth, the cannons firing a kind of furious farewell as the Ranger clawed its way out to open sea. But it is worth dwelling on that moment a little longer, because it was not merely an escape. It was a declaration, a public, deliberate, magnificently reckless statement of intent, addressed not just to Woodes Rogers personally, but to the entire apparatus of Crown authority that Rogers represented. Vane was saying, "I see what you have brought. I see the Navy ships. I see the proclamation. I see what you are offering and what you are threatening. And my answer is this fire, and these guns, and the open water ahead of me. There were men on the docks of Nassau that day, men who had just signed their own pardons, men who had chosen the safer path, who watched the Ranger go. What they felt as they watched, history does not record. Perhaps relief, perhaps something more complicated, perhaps the particular ache of watching a man do the thing you yourself could not quite bring yourself to do, even when you suspected, deep and quietly, that it was the truer thing. The sea swallowed the Ranger. The smoke from the burning prize ship drifted over the harbor, and Nassau, within weeks, began its transformation from pirate republic to properly governed colonial port. A transformation enforced by Rogers with considerable efficiency and not a little brutality, including the public hanging of 8 pirates in October of that year, their bodies left to swing on the gallows as an object lesson to anyone who had not yet made up their mind about the pardon. But Vane was not there to see it. He was already gone, already hunting, already in the small sloop with the reduced crew that was all he had managed to carry out of Nassau with him, beginning the process of rebuilding, of finding prizes, taking ships, growing his force back to something that resembled his former reach. He was stripped back to almost nothing, and he rose from it with a ferocity that should, perhaps, have surprised no one at all. Because Charles Vane without a fleet was still Charles Vane, and Charles Vane with a purpose was, as the Atlantic world was about to be reminded, one of the most dangerous things the sea had ever produced. There is a particular kind of resilience that belongs exclusively to men who have never seriously entertained the possibility of defeat. Not optimism. Optimism is a choice, a conscious decision to expect good outcomes. This is something harder and stranger than that. It is the simple bedrock inability to conceive of a future in which one has stopped fighting. The world can take everything. The ship, the crew, the harbor, the allies, the accumulated weight of reputation and power, and the man in question will look at what remains, however little that is, and begin again. Charles Vane began again. In the autumn of 1708, having been deposed by his own crew, having been set adrift by Calico Jack Rackham in a small sloop with a handful of loyal men and whatever provisions Rackham's mercy had allowed him, Vane found himself in a position that would have finished most men. He had no flagship. He had no base. Nassau was closing behind him, being rapidly reorganized under Woodes Rogers into something that no longer welcomed his kind. His most famous peers were scattered. Blackbeard was operating in the Carolinas, operating under the fragile shelter of a pardon he would soon discard, and the window of relatively ungoverned sea that the Golden Age had depended upon was narrowing with each passing month. Vane did not pause to mourn any of this. He took the small sloop, and he went to work. The Caribbean offered, even for a man with minimal resources, sufficient opportunity for a captain of sufficient nerve. Small merchant vessels moved through those waters constantly, often lightly armed, often sailing without escort. Vane, operating now with a crew small enough that a single unlucky encounter could destroy him entirely, showed a tactical patience in this period that was, for him, almost uncharacteristic. He was selective. He chose his targets carefully, avoiding vessels that might present meaningful resistance, focusing instead on the softer prizes that would allow him to accumulate more men, better weapons, eventually a larger ship. It was, in its way, a masterclass in rebuilding from nothing. And it worked. Within weeks, Vane had taken enough prizes to begin restoring something resembling his former capability. He recruited from the crews of captured vessels, men who, presented with the familiar choice between joining the pirates or being cast adrift, chose the former with varying degrees of enthusiasm. He armed his growing fleet, and he began, once again, to extend his range. By late 1718, he was operating along the coast of the American colonies again, the same hunting grounds that had made his reputation in the preceding years. He took prizes near the Carolinas. He raided in the waters around the Bahamas. He was, by any reasonable measure, back. Diminished perhaps from the height of his power, but functional, dangerous, and very much alive. And then, in November of 1718, something happened that changed the complexion of the entire Atlantic world of piracy in a single afternoon. Blackbeard died. The engagement at Ocracoke Inlet, off the coast of North Carolina on the 22nd of November, was brief and extraordinarily violent. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy, commanding 2 small sloops sent specifically to hunt Blackbeard down, engaged him in the shallow waters of the inlet and, after a ferocious close-quarters battle that left Blackbeard with 5 bullet wounds and more than 20 sword cuts before he finally fell, ended the career of the most famous pirate in the world. The impact of Blackbeard's death on the broader pirate community was immediate and significant, not simply because of the loss of the man himself, formidable as he was, but because of what his death represented. The message was unmistakable. The Royal Navy was no longer content to patrol the sea lanes and hope the pirates would eventually exhaust themselves. It was actively hunting. It was sending dedicated forces into contested waters with specific men on specific lists and explicit instructions to end them. The era of relative tolerance, of governors who looked the other way, of naval commanders who found pirate hunting less rewarding than other duties, was over. Woodes Rogers was the architect of much of this shift. His transformation of Nassau, completed with a speed and a thoroughness that surprised even his superiors in London, had removed the pirates' most important base of operations. The hangings of October, 8 men, the bodies displayed on the waterfront, had served their intended purpose as a demonstration of the new reality. And Rogers was not stopping at Nassau. He was corresponding with colonial governors up and down the American coast, coordinating intelligence, pressing London for more naval resources, and making very clear that the systematic dismantling of the Pirate Republic was a project he intended to complete. Charles Vane was on his list, near the top of it. Vane knew this, or must have known it, with the instinctive awareness of a hunted man who has survived long enough to understand the signs. The waters he had moved through with relative freedom for years were becoming uncomfortable. Naval patrols were more frequent. Colonial ports that had once received pirate vessels with quiet commercial accommodation were now under pressure to enforce the law. The network of sympathizers and suppliers that had sustained the pirate community, the merchants who sold them provisions, the tavern keepers who housed their men, the locals who warned them of approaching naval vessels, was fraying under the pressure of Rogers's administration and the fear of what association with pirates now meant. Vane adapted, as he always had. He moved. He changed his patterns. He pushed further into waters that were less patrolled, less observed, less connected to the colonial infrastructure that Rogers was steadily co-opting. It was during this period of increased pressure and changed movement that Vane's path crossed, in a remarkable and historically documented encounter with another man whose name has become embedded in the story of the golden age of piracy, Charles Johnson, whose 1724 work, A General History of the Pirates, remains, more than 3 centuries later, the primary narrative source for much of what we know about this era. Johnson, whose identity has been debated by historians for generations, some arguing he was the journalist Daniel Defoe writing under a pseudonym, was not, of course, present at Vane's exploits, but his account, compiled from court records, survivor testimony, and the kind of on-the-ground journalism that characterized the best reporting of the period, gives us much of the texture and the detail that raw official documents cannot. What those documents and that history make clear is that by early 1719, Vane's situation, while not yet desperate, was under a pressure it had not previously experienced. He was being compressed by Rogers from the south and east, by naval activity along the American coast to the north and west, by the simple, grinding attrition of operating without a fixed base, in waters that were growing increasingly hostile. He needed somewhere to be that was not on anyone's patrol route. He found it, for a time, in the Bay of Honduras, the deep, sheltered waters along the Central American coast that offered relative obscurity and sufficient prize traffic to sustain operations. Vane worked these waters through the early months of 1790, taking prizes with something of his old efficiency, maintaining the discipline, such as it ever was, aboard his vessel, that kept his crew functional and his operation viable. But the Bay of Honduras was not, in the end, far enough. The story of what happened next, the event that would begin the final chapter of Charles Vane's life, does not involve a naval battle. It does not involve a betrayal, or a clever trap set by Woodes Rogers, or any of the dramatic mechanisms by which history typically ends the careers of men like Vane. It involves something considerably more indifferent than any human enemy. It involves the weather. A hurricane, one of those catastrophic Caribbean storms that the colonial world of the early 18th century had no ability to predict, and precious little ability to survive when it arrived without warning in the open ocean. In the early months of 1719, Vane's vessel was caught in such a storm. The accounts are not precise about the exact date or location, other than placing it somewhere in the waters around the Bay of Honduras, and the result was destruction of a thoroughness that no naval engagement had ever managed to inflict upon him. The ship was wrecked. Most of the crew was killed. Vane himself was cast ashore on a small, largely uninhabited island in the Bay of Honduras, an island that offered shelter and fresh water and essentially nothing else. He survived. Because, of course, he survived. Because Charles Vane surviving things that ought to have killed him was, by this point in his story, so established a pattern that its continuation feels almost inevitable, even as the circumstances become more extreme. He survived on that island for weeks, perhaps longer, living on whatever the island could provide, waiting with the patience of a man who had learned that the sea eventually brought ships within sight of every shore for the rescue that sooner or later had to come. It came eventually in the form of a passing vessel whose captain recognized him, and made a decision. And that decision, whether born of fear, of loyalty, of moral calculation, or simple human decency toward a castaway, would have consequences that neither man could fully have anticipated, because the Atlantic world of 1709 was no longer the world it had been even 2 years before. Knowing Charles Vane was a very different thing from what it had once been, and what you did with that knowledge carried very different stakes. The noose had been tightening for months, quietly, steadily, with the patient persistence of institutions that understand they have time on their side. Now, at last, it was close enough to feel. The island had no name worth recording. It sat in the Bay of Honduras like a rumor, small, flat, fringed with mangrove and scrub, the kind of place that appeared on no chart worth consulting and offered no reason for any ship to approach it deliberately. And yet it was there, and Charles Vane was on it, and the weeks he spent stranded upon its shore represent perhaps the most quietly extraordinary passage in a life that had been anything but quiet. Think, for a moment, about what that time must have been. The man who had commanded ships and crews, who had fired cannons at the Royal Navy and sent burning vessels into the harbor mouth at Nassau, who had terrorized the Atlantic coast from the Carolinas to the Caribbean for the better part of 3 years. That man was now entirely alone, or nearly so, on a spit of sand and scrub in the Bay of Honduras, with no vessel, no crew, no weapons of consequence, and no means of going anywhere at all. He was, for the first time in his adult life, completely powerless, completely still. He could not chase. He could not fight. He could not negotiate from strength or intimidate from behind the barrel of a gun. He could only wait and endure and watch the horizon for a sail. What passed through Charles Vane's mind during those weeks, history does not record. He left no journal, no letters survive him. The man who expressed himself through action, through the velocity and violence of his chosen life, had been reduced to a stillness that must have felt, to someone of his temperament, like a particular and refined form of torment. But he survived it, weeks of it, perhaps longer, fishing presumably, and drinking whatever fresh water the island offered, and sleeping under whatever shelter the vegetation could provide, and watching, always watching, the edge of the sea where it met the sky. And then, one day, a sail appeared. The vessel that found Charles Vane was a small trading sloop, working the coastal routes of the Bay of Honduras in the way that such vessels did, carrying goods between settlements, stopping where there was trade to be done, moving with the unhurried rhythm of commercial life in that corner of the colonial world. Its captain was not a pirate hunter. He was not a naval officer. He was, by the accounts that survive, simply a mariner going about his ordinary business who happened to sail close enough to an otherwise unremarkable island to notice the figure on the shore signaling for rescue. He brought his vessel in. He took the castaway aboard, and then, as the story has it, he recognized him. The name Charles Vane, in the spring of 1709, was not obscure. It had appeared in colonial newspapers, in government dispatches, in the testimony of dozens of merchant captains who had experienced his hospitality at close quarters and lived to describe it. His face, his manner, the particular quality of his presence. These were known, at least by reputation, to any man who spent his life at sea in those waters. The captain of that small trading sloop would have had no difficulty understanding exactly who he had just pulled from the shore of an uninhabited island in the Bay of Honduras. And he made his decision. He did not turn the vessel around immediately. He did not clap Vane in irons on the spot, or throw him back overboard, or any of the more dramatic responses one might imagine. The accounts suggest that Vane was kept aboard, perhaps as a passenger, perhaps under some informal restraint, as the sloop continued its coastal trading for a time. It is possible the captain was weighing his options. It is possible he was simply unsure what to do with the intelligence he now possessed. It is possible, though this is speculation, that some part of him felt the pull of a loyalty that the age and the community he lived in made entirely comprehensible. The loyalty of one sea-hardened man to another, regardless of the particulars of their respective careers. Whatever the internal deliberation, the outcome was this: Charles Vane was eventually delivered to the authorities. He was brought to Jamaica, the most significant British colonial hub in the Caribbean, seat of the island's governor, and home to a functioning apparatus of colonial justice, and handed over to officials there in early 1719. The arrest, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no battle, no last stand, no final defiant speech delivered from the deck of a burning ship. There was simply a man, weakened by his weeks of island survival, brought ashore and placed in custody. It was, for a man who had defined himself so completely by motion and aggression, and the refusal to be contained, a profoundly anticlimactic conclusion to his operational life. But then, the endings of real lives rarely conform to the dramatic logic of the lives themselves. Charles Vane had spent years constructing a story of pure, uncompromising defiance. The story ended not with a battle, but with a rescue-turned-betrayal and a quiet walk into a jail cell in Port Royal. He was held there for months. The machinery of colonial justice in the early 18th century was deliberate and, in its own way, thorough. There were procedures to be followed, witnesses to be gathered, a trial to be properly constituted under the law. The Admiralty courts that handled piracy cases were not improvisational affairs. They operated according to established legal protocol, heard testimony from survivors of Vane's various raids, considered the evidence, and produced verdicts that were, by the standards of the day, meticulously documented. Vane's trial took place in March of 1720 in Port Royal, Jamaica. The charges against him were extensive and well supported. The witnesses who testified had no shortage of material to draw upon. Merchant captains whose ships he had taken, sailors who had suffered his particular brand of post-boarding hospitality, men who had sailed under him and were now in a position to describe, with the motivated clarity of those seeking leniency for their own crimes, exactly what life under Vane's command had looked like. He was found guilty. Of course he was found guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. The legal framework was clear, and there was never any serious possibility of another outcome. Vane did not, by any account that survives, mount a particularly theatrical defense. He had spent his life communicating through action rather than words. And the actions were now all on record, testified to by men who had survived them. There was nothing to say that the actions themselves had not already said, loudly and unambiguously, across 3 years of Atlantic piracy. The sentence was death. He was hanged at Gallows Point in Port Royal on the 29th of March, 1720. It was not an unusual location for such an event. Gallows Point had been the site of pirate executions for decades, its name a geographical bluntness that the colonial administration clearly felt served a useful public function. The harbor was visible from it. Incoming and outgoing ships could see it. The message it sent was as deliberate and as calculated as anything Charles Vane had ever communicated with his own black flag. What Charles Vane said or did not say on the scaffold, history records imprecisely. There are accounts of varying reliability, some clearly embellished by later chroniclers who felt that dramatic last words were an appropriate ornament to a dramatic life. But no single authoritative record of his final moments exists. What we can say with confidence is that he died without recanting, without the public expressions of remorse and Christian repentance that the colonial authorities typically encouraged from condemned pirates, and that some of them, motivated by genuine feeling or by the hope of posthumous mercy, provided. He died as he had lived, on his own terms, insofar as the scaffold permitted any terms at all. After the execution, his body was treated in the manner that British colonial authorities typically reserved for convicted pirates. Gibbeted, that is, hung in a metal cage or chains at a prominent location near the water, displayed as a warning to any man who might be contemplating a similar career. The practice was calculated and deliberate, part of the same communicative logic that had governed the entire campaign against the pirate republic. The living man had been a message. The dead one was too. But here is what the colonial administrators, with their gibbets and their admiralty courts and their very thorough record-keeping, perhaps did not fully anticipate. Messages can be read in more than one way. The merchant sailors and dock workers and tavern keepers who passed Gallows Point in the weeks and months after Charles Vane's execution did not all read that displayed body as a warning against defiance. Some of them, those who had themselves felt the weight of a social order that offered them very little and demanded a great deal, may have read it differently, may have seen in it not the consequence of choosing freedom, but the proof that freedom had been chosen, that it had been lived, fully and without apology, until the last possible moment. The empire had won. It nearly always does in the end. Its resources are greater, its patience longer, its institutional memory more durable than any individual life. But Charles Vane had made them work for it, had made them chase him and hunt him, and wait for a hurricane to do what they could not quite manage themselves, had refused, at every point where refusal was an option, to make it easy for them. And when the option of refusal was finally, irrevocably removed, he had taken the only form of defiance left available to him. He had not apologized. History is not kind to men like Charles Vane. It was not designed to be. History For most of the time it has been written, has been the project of institutions, of governments and churches and academies, of the very powers that men like Vane spent their lives defying. It records what those institutions found worth recording, and it frames what it records in the language those institutions found comfortable. Criminals, pirates, enemies of mankind, hostes humani generis, as the legal Latin of the Admiralty courts had it. That was the official category. That was the box into which Charles Vane was placed, tried, sentenced, and filed away. And yet here we are, 300 years later, still talking about him. That persistence is worth examining, because it is not, in the end, an accident. The men and women who have kept the story of the golden age of piracy alive, historians, novelists, filmmakers, the long, unbroken chain of ordinary people who have found something in these stories that refuses to release its hold, have not done so out of nostalgia for violence or admiration for cruelty or any simple-minded romanticism about the freedom of the open sea. They have done so, I think, because the pirate story touches something that more respectable histories tend to leave untouched. The question of what a person owes the world that made them, and what they are permitted to refuse. Charles Vane refused, comprehensively, consistently, and at the ultimate cost. He was not a good man by any reasonable definition of the term. His cruelty toward his captives, his violence that exceeded the already brutal norms of his profession, his apparent indifference to the suffering he caused. These are not qualities that soften with distance. History should not and need not romanticize them. The merchant sailors who crossed his path and bore the consequences of his particular brand of ruthlessness were real people, with their own lives and their own stories, and those stories deserve acknowledgement. But Vane's story also holds something else, something that sits alongside the brutality without cancelling it, and that accounts for why his name has survived when thousands of his contemporaries have vanished entirely into the silence of unrecorded lives. He was, in the fullest and most unambiguous sense, free. Not free in the easy, uncomplicated way that word is sometimes used. Not free from consequence, or free from danger, or free from the grinding difficulty of the life he had chosen. He was free in the harder sense, the sense that matters. He made his own choices, lived entirely by them, refused every offered exit, and accepted every resulting consequence without apparent complaint or visible regret. The empire that hanged him at gallows point is gone. The colonial apparatus that prosecuted him, the Admiralty court that convicted him, the governor whose dispatches described him as a menace to civilized commerce. These institutions have dissolved into history, their urgency reduced to archival footnotes, their authority long since expired. Charles Vane is still here, still in the record, still in his strange and violent way, present. His direct influence on history is, it must be said, limited in the conventional sense. He founded no institutions. He changed no laws, at least not directly. He left no writings, no philosophy, no school of thought. What he left was a pattern of behavior so consistent and so extreme that it functions in the historical record almost as an argument made not in words but in actions, repeated over and over across 3 years of Atlantic piracy that said, there is another way to live. It costs everything, but it exists. The golden age of piracy ended, as all ages end, not with a single decisive moment, but with a gradual, grinding accumulation of pressure. Rogers and his successors finished what they had started at Nassau. The naval patrols multiplied. The colonial legal apparatus tightened. The pardons that weren't taken were replaced by trials that were. By the mid-720s, the era was effectively over. The sea lanes returned to something resembling order. The merchant fleets moved with something resembling safety, and the brief, blazing window in which men like Vane had been possible quietly closed. But the window had been open. For 20 years or so, it had been genuinely, demonstrably open, and the men who had climbed through it, the Vanes and the Blackbeards and the Bartholomew Robertses, the women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who defied not only the law but every social expectation their world had placed upon them, had lived for that window's duration in a way that history had not previously permitted people of their station to live, loudly, dangerously, on their own terms. That is what the sea remembers, not the cruelty, though it remembers that too, honestly and without flinching, not the violence or the greed or the suffering of the innocent people caught in the crossfire of someone else's bid for freedom. It remembers all of that, but underneath it, beneath the black flags and the cannon smoke and the Admiralty Court transcripts, it remembers something simpler. It remembers that they were here, that they refused, that for a brief and blazing moment, the ocean belonged to them, and they sailed it without permission, and no force on earth could quite catch them. Until, at the very last, the forces of earth were patient enough, and numerous enough, and the hurricane did what the Navy could not. Charles Vane was ruthless. He was violent and dangerous, and by almost any civilized measure, he was wrong. But he was also, until the very end, utterly and completely himself, in a world that works very hard to prevent that. In any world, in any era, that is not nothing. That is, in its terrible and complicated way, something.